the wider public support they have in claiming political power in their own country. There is very little doubt that Ethiopia missed lots of opportunities to resolve a long-lived question of the single largest ethnic group, Oromo, whose trust is the right of self-rule in its own country, Oromia, and take a position they deserve in leading Ethiopia as a country. And the Oromo believes that Olbana Lelisa is a representation of this repression against them. In fact, Human Rights Watch released similar reports in 2001, recognizing a permanent crackdown carried out on the Oromo and various civil societies in Ethiopia. Olbana is indeed a symbol of repression consistently being carried out against the Oromo people in Ethiopia. When we come to the second topic, without going into much detail, EPRDF's government follows similar policy in interference of internal matters of various religious groups in the country, leading them into a considerable level of radicalization, which is expressing itself since recent years through Muslim protesters in Ethiopia. All of what I have said so far is not new to the UK government or any international community so far, but it is far less well understood that the repression Ethiopia is carrying out on her own citizens is underwritten by Western aid, in which the UK is the second largest contributor next to the United States. Money given by British taxpayers to prevent starvation in Ethiopia is being used by military and intelligence apparatuses of repressive regime. True, Ethiopia is regarded as a key ally for the Western world's war on terrorism in the Horn of Africa, but it is very much difficult to appreciate UK's closest support and ally with Ethiopia. It must be registered that the same state, Ethiopia, is working towards degradation of security matters in the region, using Western aid money, of course. $3 billion in long-term development aid flows into Ethiopia every year, despite consistent and incredible evidence-based allegations from human rights activists. Time will not allow me to revisit evidences revealed by independent human rights organization and BBC Newsnight Department Investigative Journalism on how the whole course of Ethiopia's incumbent regime uses Britain's taxpayers' money given in aid used as weapon of repression of dissent voices, 25 years of mass arrest, extrajudicial killings, rape, and all of this in gross disregard of children dying of hunger. Thank you.
Thank you, Etana. Our final speaker this evening is Juweriya Ali. She comes from the Ogaden Student and Women Activist and International Advocate. So I've probably misread that. She's an Ogaden student and activist, as well as an international advocate. She's going to speak this evening about the rendition and detention of the Canadian citizen, Bashir Makhtal.
I'll be speaking about Bashir Makhtal. He's a 46-year-old Canadian citizen. He's been in prison since 2006. I'm just going to give you some background on his story. So Bashir Makhtal and about 100 other foreigners were swept up in what is known as Africa's Guantanamo, a little-known chapter of US-led war on terror, in which a series of illegal rendition flights took terror suspects from Kenya to Ethiopia, one of the key allies of the US in the Horn of Africa. Once in Addis Ababa, the detainees were interrogated by security officials, including agents of the FBI. Over subsequent months, the detainees were released without charge, all except Bashir Makhtal and one Kenyan, who has essentially been declared a non-citizen by Kenya. There's no such confusion about Bashir, however, who has been Canadian since 1994. Bashir was born in 1969 in the Ogaden region and fled to Somalia in 1976 because of the Ethiopian government's oppression and its cruel atrocities. Since 1976, until he migrated to Canada in 1991, he was living in exile without the presence of his parents, brothers or sisters. He grew up in Mogadishu, Somalia, with his exiled uncle and did all of his schooling there up to secondary school, from which he graduated in 1986. His grandfather, Makhtal, was one of the leading figures of the early Ogaden resistance in the 1950s, which is part of the story of essentially why he was captured due to his grandfather's name. The people of the Ogaden, all of whom are ethnically Somali, have long fought to be independent of Ethiopia. The fight has become so bloody during the past decade that critics of the Ethiopian government have made comparisons to Darfur. Ethiopia says that it's merely responding to attacks by insurgents determined to win independence. Bashir's cousin and advocate has said that the fact that we carry the name Makhtal means that Ethiopia has always been after my family, and so many of my relatives have been beaten, put in jail, you name it. A few days before Bashir's scheduled return to Nairobi, all flights to Kenya were cancelled. By the time the Ethiopians invaded Somalia on December 26, 2006, his best chance to get out was to travel 1,500 kilometers by car to the Kenyan border. Somalis by the thousands were already fleeing the fighting. On December the 30th, he reached the Kenyan border through a legal road to obtain an entry visa, as he used to do in Jomo Kenyatta Airport. Just outside of the immigration office, he was illegally arrested at gunpoint and had his freedom and his valued Canadian passport taken away from him. Until this day, his passport is in the hands of Canadian authorities, according to his knowledge. Mr. Makhtal received trial in 2009, after 3 years of already having spent time in prison, under no charges. The trial he received in 2009 is described by Alex Neave, the Secretary General of Amnesty International in Canada, as fundamentally unfair, and to which he asks for a retrial as it does not meet internationally recognized standards. Bashir was accused of terrorism and currently faces the death penalty. Whilst imprisoned, eyewitness accounts have confirmed that Bashir has and currently is enduring a great deal of torture, and his physical health has declined greatly. The case of Bashir Makhtal has been largely ignored by the international community, and indeed this is no different to the lack of attention directed towards similar human rights atrocities committed by the Ethiopian government against the Somali people in the Ogaden. They are routinely rounded up and imprisoned, many are tortured and even executed in prison. The case of Makhtal is indeed one which the Ethiopian government is guilty of on a mass scale, and it's time that they comply with international law relating to the grounds on which they can imprison civilians. Amnesty International, his lawyer, as well as campaigners throughout Canada, have been pressuring the Canadian government. But until today, there is no clear information on when or if he's ever going to release or if he's going to receive a fair trial. The case of Bashir Makhtal is well known because he's a Canadian citizen, but what this case urges us to think about is how many stories are currently hidden, and how many people do not have the privilege of having a Canadian passport or any other passport for that matter. How many people live under the Ethiopian regime and face these similar situations on a daily basis. How many are currently living under, how many are still in detention today, how many have been executed, and how many have died in prison. That's what this case really urges us to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I thank the speakers for keeping within the time frames that are given. Thank you. We've heard just a selection of cases, but they are representative of many, many thousands more. I printed this morning some papers from the UK Foreign Office website about on Ethiopia, giving advice to those that want to invest on human rights. It says, Her Majesty's government has not found evidence of systematic or widespread human rights abuses, but does have some concerns, including about the quality of public services in some locations, the grievance redress mechanisms, and the speed, scale and sequencing of implementation. So I suppose what we need to try and do is make sure Her Majesty's government is a little bit more better informed. I'm not sure whether to pass that to...
Well, I think we have been trying to inform them and been saying, well, we look into this for you, we'll talk to the Ethiopians, and we're still waiting. But certainly the issues that are being raised tonight, I'll be more than happy if they come to some sort of format. I'll get that through certainly to the Foreign Office and say, we've heard yet again about these cases that they're basically denying that everything's okay, albeit the company's in a state of flux, progress, whatever they want to put forward. But, I'm very, very clear that there's nothing from this group that we've never ever had a problem with raising issues like this with the government, whichever government it is. When we start getting some response. The other thing is also when it comes to the past, we met the Ethiopian ambassador. We're more than happy to organise that if that's something they want to say that.
Is there anything else that we should do apart from writing to people within our own government?
Well, we have a debate on foreign parliament, because that's where it's based on a debate.
It's just that for the last 20 years I've been saying the same things and not really seeing any change in attitude. And the money just keeps going into Ethiopia, and the eventual instability in the whole of the Horn from that government is it's just not being attacked at all.
Well, it's had a lot of things in life, Trevor. It's probably the government, in their wisdom, and the previous government of this country, would probably see that the situation of working with the Ethiopian government as it is in their view, better than what the alternative might be. So if they challenge the Ethiopian government, and ultimately that government is replaced by somebody that they don't think can work with, then they take the political decision that this is the best thing to do. Well, and we've seen this right across the world where particularly Western powers view players throughout the world as political pawns. We saw it in Iraq, where for 20 years at least the government turned a blind eye to what Saddam was doing to his own people, and 1 million people died in the fight between Iraq and Iran, while we did nothing but stand back because we thought it was better for him to be trying to control the Ayatollah and the Iranians. And I think to some extent that's the probable reason that governments, that the West, ourselves and the Americans in particular, are effectively let these abuses go unchecked. It was quite clear when you talked about the gentleman said before, £3 million worth of aid sort of money. It's, I think, if I might be wrong, I'll take advice from parliamentary colleagues. If it was £3 billion in this country, it would be about the equivalent of 1% on income tax, which is a big piece of money. So, we should really be saying, in the nicest sense, why we get for our money. That isn't why you do it, but we commit to that country in a big, big way. And I think within doing that, I think this country have a right to say, if you're spending my money in that country, why are you doing it? And are these people, were the recipients of taxpayers' hard-earned money? Trying to get them to listen is another thing, but we can only try in this place. I'm sure that between us we can push forward. We need good quality information as we've had tonight, in the form that we can use it and take it forward and ask the questions of the government to say, here, what are you doing about this case? First and foremost, we could ask them, do you accept that what we're told tonight is true? If you don't, why don't you? And we'll go and sit down on the table and say, this is what we say you prove was wrong. They're more than happy to do whatever we can.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor to questions and comments. The one thing I ask you and will be quite firm about is the length of time given to each speaker. So initially I'll say up to 2 minutes, so allowing different people to speak. I can see Ernest has got his hand raised, so please.
First of all, thank you very much for this session on human rights violations in Ethiopia, especially for third world solidarity. The human rights violations in Ethiopia, as has been mentioned, is well documented. by international human rights organizations. And what we heard today is only the tip of the iceberg and highlighted cases, but tens of thousands of prisoners, of political prisoners and prisoners of conscience are languishing in Ethiopia. I think the worrying thing is the stance of the UK government. More and more, we're seeing the government distancing, itself from human rights abuses. It's more kind of standing more with despotic regimes like the current EPRF regime, rather than standing with the people. And now, recently, as you heard, after, as we heard, billions of pounds of developmental aid have been poured to Ethiopia, and then there's a so-called double-digit growth and the fastest growing economy in Ethiopia. Now 8.2 million people are needing food aid, and if help is not arriving, up to 15 million people are going to suffer. So I think the question here is, British foreign policy has failed Ethiopia in the past during the Mussolini era time, and they stood with Italy. And now we're seeing Britain again standing with dictators and tyrannical regime and abandoning the people for the sake of what? The regime allegedly is an ally for war against terror. And so this is really worrying, and I think history will record this again, and I hope this will be recorded, and through the MP Devan herself, again our protest that this short-sighted policy is endangering not only Ethiopia, but the whole region will be destabilized, because ethnic and religious conflicts are really getting out of hand. And the experiment that this regime is actually implemented in terms of ethnic politics and ethnic federalization has actually failed. So we're seeing more intra-ethnic conflict and more religious intolerance. So that is a danger. So they would, I think, one needs to see, what would happen in the future, and things are going to get out of hand.
Many thanks. Your hands, come back to you, please.
I've just got a question for Juweriya. If you could expand on some of the conditions of the Ogaden drill, and also do we have any statistics for the amount of people that are in prison and some of the conditions of the prison itself?
Sorry, it was a question.
Juweriya.
Oh, sorry, it was a question for you.
There aren't actually any statistics that they've released, because there is no order, there is no record of the people that they bring in or the people that are released. There is no record actually of the amount of deaths in the prison as a result of torture, of disease, of starvation. So the short answer is no. There is no record. There aren't any statistics at all. It's one of the most notorious prisons in the entire region, and all kinds of tortures are committed by the guards. And the important thing to remember is that it's not a case-by-case sort of atrocity. It's not that one guard transgresses. It's that it's very systematic. It's policy. It's very institutionalized. So they're trained to commit certain crimes. They're trained to torture people in a specific way. So there have been cases where soldiers who defected from the army have spoken about experiences where they've been trained on how to rape somebody, for example. That's one of the things that they've been told to do. It's very much part of their training, what they're expected to commit once at the prison. So there aren't any records at all of how many people have died in that prison. Some families think that their relative is still in prison, but in fact they could have passed away a few years ago. So there is absolutely no record. There aren't any laws in the prison. You could be arrested for no reason. There aren't any lawyers. There's nothing like that. So Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, over there.
Thank you for the chance. It's really nice that there are good people like Devan Berselman, people working in search for solidarity, and, well, institutions who, well, day in, day out, are basically advocating and being the voice of against any repression or human rights violations. We're talking about, by the way, 60 years after the Universal Rights Declaration, and that Ethiopia is one of the founding countries of that principles and articles which are ratified into its own constitutions. But sadly, I mean, I hate to say this, but it hurts me to say that British government's stance on this matter is really deplorable, in the sense that their attitude is basically, he might be a dictatorship, or it could be a repressive regime, but that is our repressive regime, okay? So keep quiet. Ethiopia has never, despite that, there are protection applications which have littered European courts and British courts for the last 2 decades here, still counting. The British government hasn't even featured anything about human rights situations in Ethiopia in its Foreign Office annual reports. Nothing has been said. So it's nice that there are good people who raise voices and say or do all their best in terms of highlighting this and turning around, but unfortunately the British government, I can tell you, is running around in the city about raising investments in Ethiopia. That we are in the era of scramble for Ethiopia, okay? Before the Chinese or the Indians or the new emerging nations are taking all the resources, we will do that. We don't care anything about human rights. So it's not just being compromised, it's totally being thrown in the bin. So respect for human rights and reclaiming back human rights really rests in the hand of only Ethiopians and good citizens of the world. So we need to think about what are the good and powerful messages that we need to send and we need to do about reclaiming back our rights. That's what we need to focus about.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I think it was very important that the individual cases were mentioned, the 4 individual cases, because there could be samples of the kind of violence that goes on in that country. It is also important that we all join together behind the question of human rights and confront this government, expose this government. There are millions, as some of you said, there are millions, there are thousands that are in there. And we can't really afford to keep quiet. Successive Ethiopian governments have failed because of human rights. Haile Selassie's government failed because 60,000 died in famine. Derg failed because 200,000 died in famine. Now, this government will fail because of the 16 million that are hungry. Well, they argue it is not 16 million, it is only 8 million. It is only 8 million is a big number. How many people are going to die out of this 8 million? Nobody knows. So there is a huge human rights violation going on in that country, and people should really look at it, listen to people campaigning like the ones here that are upholding these human rights violations. I'm especially very thankful to the all-party parliamentary group in highlighting the genocide in Benishangul Gumuz. Scores of people were killed and nobody talks about it.